And before starting my explanation, so yesterday I left one question in the chat box. I just remember because later on, when I took the screenshot, I saw one question was there, and the one who asked the question was Miss Malini ji. I think she asked the question that the role of Mossad in the operation which took in Iran. So yeah, Miss Malini ji, Dr. Malini ji asked about the question. So as you mentioned that what was the role of Mossad, which is a Israeli intelligence security, Israeli intelligence agency, and it has been working from long back. So if you talk about the case of Mossad, I probably remember it's a government agency and it's responsible for the intelligence, covert operations, countering terrorism from the under the government of Israel. It was founded in, I think, during 1949 or 1950s, sort of. And yes, of course, it is a very famous, very infamous organization. It's a very powerful, highly respected Israeli intelligence agency, and it ranks among the toppest in the world organization. So probably Mossad has been famous for its covert operations specifically, and probably its focus is more probably on the Arab nations and organizations, and it has also been the organization which was responsible for the clandestine movement of Jewish refugees out of Syria, Iran, Ethiopia. So is- Mossad is actually a big organization which has played a bigger role in the national intelligence of agency of Israel, and probably responsible for many of its activities and many of the operations which Israel took covertly. And yes, it is still activated today. So if we talk about the case of Iran, yes, of course, that Mossad worked inside Iran to launch the Operation Rising Lion, if you can remember that case. And it has the resources on the ground for Iran in many years, and it was working from last 20-25 years also. And they actually been the as some reported by some newspapers also, that this Mossad was the only intelligence agency which was having the tip for the Israel's Operation Rising Lion, and it made possible this opportunity strike on its most formidable adversary called Iran, that triggered called 12-day wars also. So yes, of course, Mossad had been instrumental in identifying those nuclear facilities, missile sites, and military bases on which the Israel performed the attacks. So yes, if you, as yesterday you mentioned, said does Mossad had any role? Yes, of course, Mossad played a big role in identifying those hotspots where we can Israeli forces and Israel Defense Forces close the operation called Operation Rising Lion. So, though every country denies from that there is any kind of agency which is working behind it, but yes, there were some news reports which were giving some evidences through which it is possible that yes, Mossad was involved behind these operations. So I hope, Malini, I think you got my answer and you got the point what I want to explain. Uh, sure, ma'am. Thank you. So now once again we'll move ahead with our study for the next aspect. That today we are discussing about the Russia-Ukraine conflict under this FDP session on the contemporary international economics and geopolitical alignments. So today we will be discussing primarily the infamous Russia-Ukraine conflict and how it has been affecting the Europe, how it has been affecting the some emerging economies like India too, and in all how it is affecting the world economic outlook. So first of all, I welcome you once again for this second last day of this FDP. And during this FDP, there had been some glitches also, some technical issues also. I'm sorry for that, but probably this FDP would at least give you a way that on which sides, on which fronts we can think about to, like, if many of us are researchers, are from the background of research, and most of us who are here in the FDP are the faculties. So it gives an idea that how we can we write a paper on it, because every day I'm presenting different topics, so one can taking his or her domain in order to understand that aspect from their perspective in their subject area. Like if I'm from economics, I'll want to study for a Russia Ukraine conflict from an economic perspective. By studying or by going through each and every slide, by going through each and every aspect of everyday issue which I take. Yesterday I took about the Iran and Israel. Today I'm taking Russia and Ukraine conflict. So getting getting more and more perspectives about that geopolitical crisis, we get an idea to write a research paper. We get an insight to write something on that particular topic. This is the whole purpose of why we are studying here, not just for an FTP. This is not just a part of a knowledge, but it at least give an idea or an insight that how we can write some paper on it, if we have any idea about such issue which is going on. And probably these days most of the people want the research papers on the contemporary issues, and what aspects we can take from the point of view of literature, from the point of view of economics, from the point of view of political science, and even the science and technology and management and many other things which are there. And even specifically if I talk about the case of finances, so last day, that is tomorrow, I'll be discussing about the financial sector also and how India will be affected into it. So I think we are good to go. And now I'll just try to share my screen. It will just take a 10-15 seconds. Let me just configure and hope my screen will be visible within 5-10 seconds to you. So I hope my screen is visible to everyone.
Yes.
Sure, sir. Thank you. So let's discuss what today we will be having a discussion on, and what all will be the points which will be our matter of study today. So first we will be discussing the infamous Russia-Ukraine conflict, how it has been affecting the energy markets, how the sanctions have been imposed, and what are the role they have on the uh, specifically the economy of US, economy of Russia, Ukraine, and specifically some European Union. And then we will discuss the rebalancing, how it will be rebalanced among the world, how the world being affected through this, how they will be gonna uh, have a uh, effect on the world economy, and how the economy will be resilient to it. So that's how we are talking about. I think my mic got muted. Okay, I just missed the. I think mic was muted. No issues. I'll just continue. So what specific points we are discussing today? Number one, we will discussing about the energy security crisis. That is how the Europe will be the prime most country which will be facing the security crisis in the energy sector due to this Russia-Ukraine conflict, because Europe being the most affected country in these conflicts, because Europe has a most of its fuel supplies, energy supplies depending upon the Russia. So since Europe has its 40% of its energy demands being fulfilled by by the Russian oil and gas supply. So it became very critical for Europe to manage that energy security crisis. Second, we will discuss about the economic disruption all over the world. That is how the economies over the world will facing a global inflation, some supply shocks, some supply chain disruption, which has been because of these conflicts. Third, we will discussing about the food security crisis which gonna arise and which has actually affected all over the world, because Ukraine and Russia are called the food baskets also. And yes, they accounted for about 54% of the wheat, barley, and oats altogether. So both Russia and Ukraine, specifically called as the food baskets, they have been pivotal in the case of food exports, and specifically we are talking about the trade in wheat, barley, and oats. So they cover about 50% of the world exports of these food items, specifically wheat and barley. Hence, it will create a food crisis. How it has been prevented, how it can be prevented, and what all has failed to prevent. And lastly, we'll be talking about the strategic rebalancing, how the diversification could be made, how we could prevent such situations where the world could face a supply chain disruption, and how this shock could be resisted at best. So far as if you talk about the energy crisis for European countries. So if I talk about the European nations, so this is the condition of European energy reliance on on the Russia. If we talk about, so 40% of it, the 40% of the European Union imports are from Russia of natural gas, 27% of crude oil imports of European Union. So this is the energy reliance or dependence of Russia, of European Unions on the Russia. So primarily, if we can take that, about 40% of the natural gas imports of European Union is made from Russia. This was from the year 2021. So this was used to be the energy reliance on Russia by the whole European Union, EU member states specifically. So number one is the natural gas. So 40% of the natural gas of European Union import are accounted from Russia. 27% of crude oil becomes the 27% of EU imports. Coal becomes the 46% of EU imports. The total energy consumption, that is Russian fossil fuels, represent 20% of the EU energy consumption. So it's about the 1/5 of the European Union energy consumption, which comes from the Russian fossil fuel. So this is how the Russia has been pivotal in the case of EU energy demand. So how the EU energy demands is dependent on Russian oil supplies, crude supplies, natural gas supplies, and at last the energy supplies. So this is what we are talking about. So how much energy demands of European Union are being filled by Russia? That signifies that how much the shock could have been. Now we talk about the critical infrastructure aspect. So the movement of these gas supplies are also being affected. How? There is a Nord Stream 1, which applies to Germany. So it's an undersea pipeline that carries large volumes of Russian natural gas directly to Germany and from there to other European countries. So this is the number one critical infrastructure which will have an effect on movement of natural gas and movement of supplies. So this is first critical infrastructure which will being affected due to this conflict. The second will be the Ukrainian transit route. There are some older pipelines cross Ukraine.
ಓ ಈಗ ಓನ್ಲಿ ಇದು ಆಗಿತ್ತದು ಅಲಾವ್ ಇದು ಅಲಾವ್ ಜಿಮೇಲ್ ಟು ರೆಕಾರ್ಡ್ ವಿಡಿಯೋ ಅಂತ ಬಂತು. ಓಕೆ ಅಂದೆ ನಾ ಅಲಾವ್ ಮಾಡ್ದೆ, ಅವಾಗ ಬಂತು. ಐ ಆಮ್ ನಾಟ್ ಬಟ್ ಈಗ ಸೌಂಡ್ ಬಂತದು. ಸೌಂಡ್ ಮೇಲೆ ನೋಡಿಲಿ ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಮಾರ್ಕ್ ತೋರ್ಸಕತ್ತಿತ್ತದು.
Yeah, also please, ma'am. So yes, sir. I shall continue, sir. Shall I continue?
Yes, I think you can go.
Sure, sir. So when we talk about the critical infrastructure, which will have a difficult phase right now, which will be gonna facing a lot of crisis right now is being these four critical infrastructural points, which will create a lot of uh, effects on the energy supplies, because they are the key points from where the EU gets its energy supply from the Russia and the Ukraine. So as I have discussed, so first is the Nord Stream 1, that provides supplies to Germany through Russia, which moves from provides Russian natural gas to Germany, that is a part of EU. Second is the Ukraine transit route, which has some older pipelines across Ukraine, moving Russian gas towards Central and East Southern Europe. Third is the Yamal pipeline, which via Poland runs from Russia through Belarus and Poland to Germany, and another key artery gas for deliveries. So these four critical points, from which becomes the most important routes through which the oil and gas have been supplied. And fourth ones become the Turk stream via Turkey to transport Russian gas across the Black Sea to Turkey and then into southern Eastern Europe. So these are the four critical points and four critical pathways to which the gas and oil being supplied through the European nations, all the and most of the EU member states, and which all runs from Russian, Ukraine, Russia, Ukraine, Russian, Ukraine pathways, and the primarily the Black Sea, which is in the central of this conflict, and that has a very significant aspect, because Black Sea will be the most important and the most strategic place which will have an effect of this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So Black Sea and the pipelines on these routes are primarily being affected through this Russia-Ukraine conflicts, and hence there will be a lot of shock to the supplies. Now, how will this crisis being responded? So this was February 2022. Then how the European Union tried to resist, and how it responded to this crisis of energy through various measures undertook. So when we talk about the day one impact, as these supplies being disrupted due to the Russia-Ukraine conflicts in February 2022, there was a very immediate response from European Union member states to contain or to resist this supply shock, to resist the cost of the increase in the cost of movement of oil and gas supplies, and specifically how to resist this type of supply shock on their imports from Russian and Ukraine pathways. So
Sir, we have a request to turn on the slideshow if possible.
sure, sir. I think now my slides are quite visible. So, as we are talking about the immediate crisis response, this was in February 2022 when the war actually turned on, and there were some initial impacts, and how these initial impacts been resisted. That is what I'm talking about. So, initially, the natural gas prices surged by 115% from 23rd February to 31st July 2022. So, within these 4-5 months, the natural gas price rose by more than 100%, and this is quite significant, and this is quite this is quite a significant increase in the price levels, and this is echoing a big short price rise, which is reflected in the form of 115%, and this is probably due to the supply chain being disrupted, these pipelines being these movements of goods and the movements of oil and natural gas being disrupted because of the conflicts, and there is some crisis in the Black Sea, which has led to the disruption in the supply, the movement of ships, and the movement of the oil and the gas supplies. Second was the electricity price rise that gone by 237% in the same period. Thirdly, the oil prices reached to 500 per ton from 270, so it just doubled. So pre-war and post-war, if you can see the price, the oil price per ton remained 270, now it reached to 500, so it just got doubled. So you can see the natural gas price, electricity prices, and the oil prices, they almost got doubled by their amount. So this significantly shows that how much it would cost to European Union and EU member states because of this Russia-Ukraine conflict on their oil supplies, gas supplies, natural gas supplies, and specifically for the energy supplies. So this energy sector and the energy demands for EU was under a big crisis due to this Russia-Ukraine conflict. It is quite visible, quite viable, quite echoing through this data which we're discussing about. Now, what emergency measures EU took? So, first of all, EU made a storage mandate. That means the 80% of the gas requirements are to be stored by November 2022 and 90% by 2023, so that they have a buffer stock with them of this gas, EU gas, which becomes a primary good of consumption for the EU member states, so that they can be at least secured, or they have energy security for the coming 1 year or 2 year by how long the war will continue. Secondly, they have reduced the gas consumption by 15% voluntarily across the member states by using some or the other methods through which they can try to reduce their gas demands. They have started using the low thermostatic instruments where they can have a less energy demand, so that they can save their energies for the coming future, which is very much uncertain for them. And at last, they have postponed their coal and nuclear phase out, say, due to their movement towards the renewable sources of energy, towards some green initiatives. They have started phasing out some coal and nuclear plants, but now they just postponed it. Their phasing out of their coal and nuclear plants to close down, because they don't know how much the future will be certain, for how long they have to wait for these conflicts to get stabilized and then the supplies to get stabilized. Therefore, they postpone that and keep on producing, uh, keep the operations for coal and nuclear plants to be there, because they don't know whether, because if in case there are no energy supplies, or there are some hit from the energy supplies, at least they have these alternative sources from coal and nuclear plants, so they keep on running them rather than phasing out. Now we come to the repower EU strategic response. Now that was the immediate response. Here we come that how the EU reacted with a strategic response to this energy crisis, which might lead to, or which is actually leading to, a rise in the price level, rise in the inflation in the EU member nations because of high cost of natural gas supplies to EU. So, how to combat this energy crisis? What EU has proposed and what EU had tried to do. This we are discussing, and this we want to study that how and what EU uh, took as a step to as a response to this power crisis, this energy crisis, and what are the three pillars of that. So it was launched in May 2022. So first step took by EU member states was the energy diversification. So what they tried is the joint EU gas purchases through energy platform, that from other nations, that is diversifying their consumption from other nations except Russia and Ukraine. Second was LNG imports from US, Qatar, and Norway. That this is also a sort of diversification of their imports, rather than being dependent on Russia and Ukraine as they are involved in conflict. They have developed some another ways and means to which they can fulfill their import demand. They have established some new pipeline projects, that is Baltic pipeline, vertical corridor, Baltic pipeline from Norway to Poland, so as the pipeline and the pipeline pathways from Russia and Ukraine, as I have already mentioned, Jet Nord Stream 1, the Turkey pipeline, those being under the uh, shock, and they are facing some of the other issues due to this conflict. And yes, those lines are on vulnerability right now, and there are some issues with that because of this conflicts. So since those pipelines are not safe, those movements are not safe, so EU tried to develop some new pipeline projects which are quite at a distance and quite work as an alternative to those pipelines, to those pathways, as those pathways and pipelines are right now under the area of warfare and under the conflict. So that's therefore, in order to save their movements of goods demand or their pipeline or the energy imports, they have started to develop some new pipeline projects. As I have mentioned, one is Baltic pipeline and vertical corridor. So Baltic pipe is from Norway to Poland, which is quite an alternative mechanism to move their to fulfill their import demand of the oil, natural gas, and other supplies. Secondly, the vertical corridor, like linking Greece, Bulgaria, and Romania. So these two alternative pipeline projects have been developed in order to counterweight, or in order to have some or the other ways and means through which they can have the oil supplies on the natural gas supplies, as those routes are now under being the area of conflict. They have also targeted to reduce their energy consumption by the 2030 by 13%, and immediate demand reduction on gas and oil by 5%. So these were the measures launched under the energy diversification program in 2022 May. The second pillar of their energy infrastructure transformation was the development of new LNG terminal, as the initially the pre-war capacity or was 164 BCM per year. They have planned the additions of 195 billion cm per year by 2026. So initially they were having only 164. Now they have developed it. They have planned to develop it by 195 so as to fulfill their domestic demand. And it took for about the investment of 7 billion euros, and their future capacity expected to be 400 BCM per year by 2030. So they have started transforming their energy infrastructure so as they can reduce their dependence on the imports from Russia and Ukraine for their energy demands. And some key projects are floating surge regasification units in Germany, expansion of existing terminals in Netherlands, Greece, Croatia, and enhanced interconnections between EU nations. So this is how, with these projects and these infrastructure transformations, you could able to contain, or you could able to resist these types of shocks by developing its own infrastructure, by reducing the import dependence on for its energy demands. Next, we come to the sanctions architecture and impact. Now, how the sanctions have affected the EU and the movement of oil, and how it has affected the EU markets also, that we want to discuss about. If anyone wants to ask something, doesn't be able to follow what I have all discussed right now, can put in the chat box. Let me check the chat box. Someone would have asked something. I think it's okay. We are good to go. So when we talk about the sanctions, so what was the timeline for the energy sanctions? So in December 2022, European Union put some sanctions on the Russian oil and coal. In 23-24, there was a gradual reduction in Russian gas and imports. And then the price cap mechanism, that is G7, plus oil price ceiling implementation. So these were the energy sanctions which were put on Russia. How they have been effective? So Russian energy exports to EU fell from 21% to 4% in oil, from 24% to 14% in gas, and this has impacted Russian exports revenue by 100 plus billion dollars in form of export earnings. They have also developed some shadow fleet operations. Now, what is shadow fleet operations? It's a covert movement of goods and services from one nation to other nations, though there have been imposed with the sanction. So shadow fleet means there are some operations. Let's say EU has put some sanction on the Russian movement of goods and services towards EU, but still there are movements, some illegal movements, some covert movements of goods and services from Russia or Ukraine towards the EU member states. And then the last part was the alternative markets. Yes, China, India increased the Russian imports, though Russian export earnings have been affected a lot, but Russia tried to diversify its exports towards the Asian economies, which have not put yet any sanction on the Russian goods. So Russian energy exports, yes, they have declined a lot, from 21% to 4% in oil, 24% to 14% in gas, and this has actually impacted their export earnings. But there are still some shadow fleets. Shadow fleets mean the operations which are carried out covertly or might be illegally from Russia to European member states. And there's another way out for Russia, that it could be increased Russian imports in the alternative markets like China and India. Now we come to the third aspect of it, that is the global inflation and economic disruption, how it has affected the global economy and what it had led to in the form of global economic disruption. So first of all, we discuss about the inflation impact. So it has been expected that global GDP was reduced by 1.5% in 2022 because of this supply chain disruption, reduction in the export earnings, reduction in the movement of goods and services, reducing in the volume of trade, movement of trade, and hence also some currency destabilization of some currencies, destabilization of movements of goods, movement of capital, finances, and many other things. And at last, the stock markets got fluctuated. And at all, we can tell that there are some slowdown in the economy, world economic growth by 1.5%. Second, we talk about the case of inflation. Almost each and every country faced a high rate. Each and every country faced a surge in their inflation percentage points by 1 to 1.5% because of this supply shock caused by this disruption in the supply chain. Third was the energy price volatility. It was causing a 9% rise in OECD countries because as the supplies from the Russian economy or from the Russian shippings they have reduced, so it has led to the increased demand from other OECD nations, and this has led to the price rise by 9% by other OECD nations because they have also raised the price as there are more demand from other nations except from Russia, because some of the nations have tried to diversify their imports from Russia of oil towards other nations in the OECD countries, and hence OECD nations rise their prices because this has actually led to rise in their average energy cost about 9%. So there is a rise in the energy prices and expected to about 9 to 10% in the OECD countries, and led to the energy price being swinging around. Next, the supply chain cost shipping rates increased by 60% for dry bulk goods, with as we can see the Black Sea routes been disrupted, and the vessels are now rerouted on the longer paths because of the conflict or because of the disturbances on the Black Sea. The cost of moving the bulk goods like grain, coal jumped, and they have rose for about 60%. The movement of this cost of shipping rose by 60%. This has led to higher transportation cost and energy expenses, leading to the rise in the inflation rates, and hence the overall energy prices got rose like anything. And at last, it has also caused some currency volatility. As I have mentioned, currencies were having a volatile movements as they have seen a lot of disruption in the movements of trade. And yes, there were also some capital flow disruptions from Russian projects towards some other nations because Russia and Ukraine are going through a conflict. So usually, when a country faces a warfare, it has been expected that there will be a movement and outflow of capital. Even some other nations will have a effect on them also, because they have somehow some or the other way connected with that economy. Like I have mentioned with you how EU is dependent for its energy demands on Russia. Now the investments in EU will also be disrupted because EU will be facing a high rate of inflation. EU will be facing a high effect of that supply chain disruption because it is more dependent for its oil imports on Russia. And now since Russia is going through a war and EU has to put a sanction on it and many other things are there, this will lead to the fall in the investment, fall in the projects, or outflow of capital, fleet of capital from European member nations also. Next is the part of the agriculture crisis and the food subsidy for the food security. So the second most important aspect of this Russia-Ukraine conflict on the world trade will be the agricultural sector, because there are a lot of agricultural goods being exported from Russia and Ukraine altogether. So if you can see the agricultural importance and significance of Ukraine, specifically in case of the food products, specifically the food security, if I talk about the agricultural products, if I talk about, if you can see that Ukraine composed or or provides for about 12% of the world total wheat exports. In the global wheat exports, Ukraine has a contribution. Ukraine has a share of 12%. So it's a big number for a world exports if we talk about, and it will actually be gonna have a very big effect, a very significant impact on the food supplies all over the world, and specifically the case of wheat exports, if I talk about. Secondly, if I talk about the sunflower oil, so it is about 46% of the global exports. So it means that almost 50% of the global trade, or the 50% of the global supplies of the sunflower oil, is been from Ukraine. So you can see how much they could affect the whole world in the food supply chain. Next, if we combine it with Russia, so it becomes 54% of wheat, barley, and oats trade. So that means it both of them becomes the food basket, because they supply 50% of the world supply in, or the world food supply, if I say, and hence it will be a biggest in agricultural and food security crisis for all over the world. Though there were some initiative called as Black Sea Grain initiatives to ensure the food security in some or the many other nations which are dependent on the food supplies for their food supplies on these two nations. So in order to retain that food security, in order to prevent any kind of food crisis, there was a Black Sea Green initiative. This was an initiative between United Nations and Turkey in order to keep their food supplies being perennial, food supplies being persistent, and food supplies being not get affected through this conflict. Though there was some success through that 33, as we can see, that 33 million tons of exports being done to 45 countries under this Black Sea Grain initiative. About 1,80,000 tons grain been destroyed in 10 days post termination, because this initiative was for 1 year. It's an agreement between United Nations and Turkey, along with Russia and Ukraine's team. So in order to retain the food crisis, in order to retain the food supplies, so as to prevent any kind of food supply crisis in other nations because of this conflict. And then the alternative routes like Danube River, EU land corridors being developed. And there were a lot of cost implications, which was for 3 to 4 times higher than what it used could be the normal case, and 5 times longer distances. So this initiative, though involved a lot of cost, though it was quite successful, but later it was being terminated. So this was the Black Sea Initiative. It was an agreement negotiated by the United Nations and Turkey between the Russia and the Ukraine during the warfare. So the purpose was to prevent a food crisis by enabling Ukrainian grain ships to safely leave the Black Sea exports. It worked like the ships carrying grain were inspected by the joint team of four members, that is UN, Turkey, Ukraine, and Russia, so as to ensure that they carry only the food, not the weapons. And yes, it impacted about a lot, for 33 million tons of grain being exported, including wheat, corn, sunflower oil, to other food staples exported to 45 nations. So though it played a big role, but later it was being retracted, and then there was again a disruption possible. Now, how the transportation and logistic means rebalance, this is also one we want to discuss today. So Black Sea ports, as they rendered unsafe, inaccessible, because they are in the middle of the crisis, they are in the middle of this conflict. So they have started, the nation started to develop some alternative ports and alternative sources and alternative ways through which they can ensure their food supplies and ensure their the goods and good supplies, or the trade supplies. So they try to reroute around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, though it took more than 10 to 15 days, and hence causing 40% more fuel cost. So this is also a biggest maritime disruption, because rerouting the exports, rerouting the goods and services shipping through another route, causing a 40% increase in the fuel cost. This also led to the rise in the insurance premium due to war risk, because as the movement of goods are there are more huge risk of goods being destroyed due to the war being going on. And then there was alternative port utilization in Romania, Poland, Germany, and many other nations. There were some land route adaptations also, like Ukrainian border crossings increased 34%, Polish border blockade impacts, Danube River ports increased cargo handling, and rail gauge differences creating bottlenecks. So there were some or the other transportation constraints were there, logistic disruptions were there, but they have been keep on trying to rebalance it, to reinstate whatever could be possible. Though it will cause a lot of cost, because if you go by the rerouting, if you go by the rebalancing, it would create some or the other accommodating cost for that. So there are some expected long-term structural changes also. But if we talk about the current status and future outlook, so as we talk about the case of EU consumption, gas consumption have reduced below 2019 level. Russian pipeline gas flows reduced to trickle. LNG terminals operational ahead of schedule, and renewable energy tracks targets are on track. So how these full complete energy crisis could be retained is could possible only with of two ways and means. First, to develop an energy infrastructure so as you can have a less dependence on the Russia and the Ukraine, and secondly you can reduce your consumption level, and at last you can move towards the renewable energy sources. And the ongoing challenge which been faced by these disruptions is the energy cost competitiveness versus US markets, infrastructure financing, grid integration, geopolitical stability, supply security, and yes, the climate targets versus the energy security balance. So though on one side we have to balance our energy security by developing our own sources of energy, but we are having some climate targets which will get delayed, which will get affected due to this. So this was all from my side. These are some research questions for further study. If we talk about the case of energy markets, how we could find an optimal balance between energy security and the cost competitiveness. Second, the role of nuclear energy in post-fossil fuel transition. Third is the integration challenges for intermittent renewable sources, how we can develop some renewable sources during this crisis, and what could be the possible challenges for that. This is a case of green inflation also is on rise right now. Second, if we talk about the case of economic impact, so we can study the long-term inflationary effects of this transition cost, because energy transition costs a lot of hurdles for an economy. Second is the regional economic disparities and transition of adaptation, because not each and every EU member is on the same level, or is not having the same level of capacity to transform their energy demands, or to transform their energy sector. Thirdly, the industrial competitiveness in high energy cost environment. So these are the three main questions which you can study for and do a research paper on it. So yes, we can take one takeaway from it, that yes, it is a crisis driven policy responses which can create some last longing structural changes which could fundamentally alter the global energy security paradigms. Yes, we can have a transition on the security in the energy security sector, how we can ensure that our energy demands or our energy consumption is being resilient to the global supply chain disruption. That's a lesson for every nation, how to develop a resilient global supply chain or change, or how we can go with some structural changes or transformation, though, so as we become resilient towards any outward energy shock or global supply shock. Thank you so much. This was all from my end. I will be sharing these PPTs at the last day, because as Punisher mentioned. So now I open the house for the question, any comments, any feedback from your side. I'm welcoming you to please come up. Thank you so much.
The session is open for questions. If you have any, please you can post your questions in the chat box, or else you can also unmute and ask a question. So we have about 10 minutes plus.